Thank you, Marcy. Good morning, church. Get your Bibles out, all right? Let's start this way. This is my Bible. It contains God's will for my life. I can become what it says I can become. Today, I will study from His Word. My mind is alert. My heart is receptive. I'll never again be the same. Amen. Our world is changing rapidly. I suspect it's changing even more rapidly than some of us may be aware. Last week, we talked about some things that have been responsible for getting us where we are. And one of those was secularization, the fact that anything spiritual or relating to God is totally removed from society. The second thing we looked at was pluralization. No longer is it just the Judeo-Christian idea to be engaged and questioned and believed, but now it's all the religions of the world are available and being promoted. And finally, there's privatization. The idea that if you have something and it's contrary to the mainstream idea or thought of the culture, it's okay to have it, but you just keep your mouth quiet. We talked about political correctness. It's defined as a process of speaking without offending anyone. I don't think that's possible. A few voices in charge of culture are allowed to speak, and everyone else in the culture is expected to just respond in kind. There is a trans epidemic sweeping throughout the Western world, and I'm concerned about the one that's happening in America. Today, whole groups of female kids from elementary school and on upward are coming out as transgender. Someone says, Jerry, why is this suddenly your concern? Well, it's not sudden. I must have been living under a rock because about a year ago, I began to get a lot of information. I began to read. I began to study buckets of books. But I couldn't consume enough because it really concerns me. So what I'm sharing with you this morning is not anything typical, but I think it's important for us to be aware of. I'm going to state that the things that I'm going to share with you this morning are evil. The scripture that was read for us by Marcy in Romans chapter 1 covers it again and again. I could take those verses and put them around things that I'm going to discuss this morning, but just keep that in mind as I'm sharing this information. In 2017, had one gender clinic. What? 2007, sorry. My bad. Thank you. Since 2007, they had one. In 2007, they had one gender clinic. Anybody want to guess how many they have today? 300. So now there are what's called pediatric gender care clinics all throughout the United States. Planned Parenthood in Oregon will give testosterone to 15-year-old girls without anyone's permission on the first visit. Kaiser dispenses testosterone to adolescent girls. So whether or not you display the typical gender dysphoria or not, testosterone is available like aspirin. A double mastectomy is known as top surgery. I suppose top surgery sounds better if you were going to do that on a 12 or 13-year-old girl. They do not necessarily need parental control, and they absolutely do not need any type of a certificate or note from a therapist. Let's talk about this phenomenon a bit. How did we get to where we are? How did we get to the place where we're supposed to pretend that the only way that you can know that I'm a man is if I use the proper pronoun? At least a partial answer to get us started, I think, is the reluctance or the refusal or the absolute lack of knowledge when we talk about issues that deal with this. I think we've had ideas about what's going on around the corners, but never really faced it head on. What is gender dysphoria? It is a severe discomfort with one's biological sex. It's exceedingly rare. It occurs in 0.1% of the population in the past, all overwhelmingly males. Keep that 0.1%, 0.01%. So roughly 10,000 males, all right, 1 in 10,000. I lived in Porterville. It was 10,000 people when I moved there in 1960, so it would be nobody that I knew, likely. Today, up to 2017, it would often display itself as a little boy, maybe a 2-year-old, 4-year-old, who say, "Mommy, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl." So to help us wrap our mind around this whole thing, we need to look at 3 separate issues. The first one is this: there are young kids who have the classic presentation of gender dysphoria, the majority of whom would naturally outgrow it and historically have. Number 2, there is a social contagion currently spreading among adolescent girls, many whom do not have the typical gender dysphoria presentation at all. Third, there are the activists who have already begun exploiting our social confusion and our sympathies to invade women's private spaces, and I believe to destroy women's sports. Private spaces mean, we'll look at this next week, but private spaces meaning boys can go into girls' bathrooms and shower rooms. All 3 of these are very different. So let's look at the first. Traditionally, among young boys, if left alone with no intervention, either by changing of the pronouns or no medical intervention, at least 70% of these kids typically outgrow gender dysphoria on their own, and usually it's done by the time high school is over. But today, in 2022, we don't leave kids alone to outgrow their gender dysphoria and others to transition into adulthood. Today, when a child doesn't seem exactly masculine or feminine as we think, the statement is, "That's a trans kid." In 2022, we take them to a therapist or a doctor, nearly all of whom, not all, but nearly all of whom have accepted it's their job to immediately affirm that patient's self-diagnosis and to immediately begin medical transition. In the typical next step, these kids, after dealing with the pronouns, they begin puberty blockers. Now, for the life groups tonight, I've put out some little different material, and you can discuss, there'll be an opportunity to discuss puberty blockers and other things in greater detail. But puberty blockers shut down the pituitary that directs the release of hormones catalyzing puberty. There is an attempt now to begin these puberty blockers with kids as young as 8 years old. The most common drug that has been used, and they've got some new ones, but the most common was Lupron. Lupron was never FDA approved. It never has been. It probably never will be. It was designed to be used on repeat sex offenders who could not seem to change. But now that drug has been the drug of choice. So you might ask yourself, why would any doctor do this? Why would any parent agree to this? In the doctor area, if the doctor refuses to do this, in the state of California and other states, actually pretty much everywhere, if what's before the Senate now continues and is passed, because Congress already passed it, it will be illegal for a doctor to do this, to refuse treatment, and he will lose his license. And if that bill continues through the Senate and it passes, if you receive to give your child that treatment, they can be taken away from you. I'm not telling you what I think it means. I'm telling you what it means. There's really no satisfying answers to why a doctor or parent would do that, because scientists have no way of predicting which children will outgrow the dysphoria and which won't. There's just no way of knowing. But the argument is, these kids are suffering. They can't wait. And so the suicide rate among trans-identified youth and adults is extremely high. According to the National Library of Science, 82% of transgender individuals have considered killing themselves. 40% have attempted suicide, with the highest suicidal amongst transgender youth. The argument goes that we need to get in there and start fixing it as soon as possible, and taking the most dramatic or drastic steps that can be taken. Unfortunately, there's no long-term studies that indicate that this would produce a cure from suicidality, or that they would get a better mental outcome from any of it. Why no long-term studies? We know from science that puberty blockers suppresses a bone disc density. And doctors just don't want to keep a child on that more than 2 years. That's been the rule. Nearly 100% of kids who put on puberty blockers proceed to cross-sex hormones. Cross-sex hormones is when you take enough of this hormone that you will begin to look more like the gender you identify with. The other one stops the process of what you are going to be, and this one will supposedly try to change that into what you want it to be. We know that if a child goes from puberty blockers to sex hormones, that child will be infertile. The claim that puberty blockers are a pause button without serious side effects is absolutely not true. Would we accept this kind of deceptive salesmanship in any other area of medicine? For nearly 100 years of diagnosing gender dysphoria, these little kids, 2 to 4, usually boys, are what society was talking about. Just a week and a half ago, our governor signed legislation that will block state officials from enforcing state laws that hinder access to transgender medical procedures and drugs. He went on, Jesus did, what comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and make the man unclean. Jesus' famous statement is, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. In the last decade, really in the last 5 years, there's a large part of social media has been helping another population that claims to have gender dysphoria. Before 2007, there was no scientific evidence that stood out regarding having gender dysphoria at all among teenage girls. A Brown University researcher, Dr. Lisa Littman, termed or coined the phrase rapid onset gender dysphoria. It refers to a sudden spike in transgender identification among teen girls who have absolutely no history of dysphoria at all. Again, we're talking about teenage girls. The rate of these teenage girls claiming trans identification has risen drastically in the Western world, a rise of 4,400% in teenage girls, as easily quantified by the UK system, which is a nationwide health system. So if we looked at the original, it was 0.01%, but the spike has gone to 4,400%. That's not a typo. That's not a mistake. From 2017 to 2022, in 5 years, you move from this to a 4,400% increase. Why are teenage girls now the leading demographic into gender dysphoria? One answer is social contagion. It's teen girls sharing and spreading their pain. When I was doing my paramedic training, we were very careful to keep volemic patients and other patients separated. We were very careful to keep them at a distance from other people because we didn't want them to get together and share in that. Well, there's something like that is happening today. Teen girls, according to recent research, are in the midst of the worst mental health crisis on record and the highest rates of anxiety, self-harm, and clinical depression, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association. A common contagion is in the same high anxiety group. These are the girls who struggle in adolescence and tend to hate their bodies. Now, I didn't grow up as a girl, but I've heard from people and I've read that this is the case. Add to that the school environment to where in the last 5 or 6 years, you can become an immediate hero and popular if you claim trans identity. Add further the great many trans social media influencers, and you get some idea. They can't wait to convince these troubled teens that they need to start trans and testosterone treatments. And if you will just do that, all of your problems will go away. Again, I'm not telling you what I think they say. This is what they say. Another thing that adds to the spread of this, probably like nothing else, is TikTok. TikTok used to be called Musical.ly. TikTok is a short-term video app that allows users to create 15-second snippets on any topic. They got a wide selection. By the way, these are top-notch done. They're not garbage and grainy. They're top-notch. You can take your own videos and add to that. The cost of running it is into the millions. Do you know who owns TikTok? China. China owns TikTok. They've tried to get sponsors. It's sort of hard to get sponsors, but they really don't care how much money it takes, as long as they can keep pumping that here. And by the way, TikTok is not allowed in China. TikTok is not allowed in China. They will not allow to happen to the Chinese girls what's happening to Western girls. Regardless of what you think of President Putin, the Russian government just fined TikTok $68,000 for pumping what they say is propaganda about this into the system. They say we're not going to allow this in Russia either. A worldwide app, if you're going to download it from the App Store, 500 million monthly, 80 million just from America. So if you look down at the bottom on the screen, you can see this arrow in TikTok, and after it was bought out, called Musical.ly, which was a crazy name, but it was bought out in 2012. Now look where it is. Fourth, only behind Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and there's TikTok. If I had children, I wouldn't let them anywhere near TikTok. Someone says, well, yeah, but Jerry, there's some good things. There's some good things a lot of places. It's been about 40 years ago. I went into a beer joint to get a friend, a member of the church. I said, what are you doing in here? He said, what are you doing in here? I said, what are you doing in here? I came to get you out. He was sitting on a stool, and I discovered, Larry, that in there they have some really good nuts called beer nuts. And the stool I was sitting on was really, really comfortable, and they had nice chairs. But that's about the only good thing I can say about it. The rest of it was evil. If I had the power to snap my fingers and get rid of anything, it would be this. I'm sorry, I need to take a deep breath. If your eyes are opening, you're beginning to understand of the social contagion. There's no other explanation. These teen girls are in a great deal of pain. Many of them are at the point of they've been involved in some diseating order. They've been cutting themselves, doing bodily harm. They have mental health comorbidities. They don't need to be given something else to compound those things. And now children are being allowed to self-diagnose with gender dysphoria by the medical establishment, who's decided that their job is merely to affirm what these girls are saying is true. Our medical establishment in regard to transgender adolescents, we have effectively turned doctors into life coaches. Have you heard the name Carabelle? Probably not. Carabelle lives in England. She was a troubled kiddo in adolescence. She was rushed into transition in her teen years and came to deeply regretting her transitioning to a male. The Court of Justice, which is the UK's Supreme Court, examined her case, and a group of other girls were in her category, and she won. They said, and I quote, "It is highly unlikely that the children aged 13 and under would have the capacity to give consent." You think? England's, they were horrified. They said young girls have been allowed to consent to eliminating their future fertility and sexual function at an age when they could not have possibly gauged the loss. Jesus had a little child in his lap. The disciples were always on him about getting those kids out of here. We got something heavy to talk about or something. And Jesus said, "Such is the kingdom of heaven." And he said, "But if anyone causes one of these little ones to believe in me to sin, it would be better to have a millstone hung around his neck and be thrown in the depths of the sea." Evil, pure evil. Now, this case in England was a landmark case. It was covered by the London Times, the Economist, the Guardian, covered by all the major news outlets. It was seen as a real condemnation of putting these girls on a fast track to transition. In fact, they closed down a 1,000, I'll just say bed place, and said it's not going to function anymore because this had been its function. If you didn't read about Kara, don't beat yourself up, because the American media didn't cover it. The only thing that I can assume from the total blackout is they just wanted to pretend that it didn't exist, that it never happened. There are thousands of children, an awful lot, the vast majority teenage girls, who regret what they're done, and the media does everything it can to keep them silent. If you get on TikTok and you look at the areas about transition, you'll see people happy and jumping around as though they had found their utopia. These are young women who underwent medical transition. They later attempted to change it. You know, they give them whatever treatment they can, but it's permanent. Sometimes they can't redo it. If you kept someone from transitioning, from making the transition into puberty, you can't go back and redo things. I think that this is, in my lifetime at least, the greatest medical scandal of all time. And it makes me so sad. When I get on and I watch those girls, I can sit there and cry. You feel them pouring out their heart, and they're saying, "Why was I allowed to do this? Why was this allowed to happen to me in 9 to 12 months? It's interesting that children can go and get testosterone at age 15 at a clinic, but you can't get a tattoo until you're 18, unless your parent shows up with you. Does that say anything? I wished I could have covered this in 1 week. I haven't left you with a lot of good news. But if you becoming aware of this has made you a little bit wiser, then I feel like my time was worth spent. I would rather be teaching about grace or Jesus or 1,000 things other. But church, I can't live under a rock. I can't pretend these things aren't happening. And I don't expect you or me or anyone else to start marching on the corner, but I do expect us to be knowledgeable enough to think about it, to understand it, to speak about it. Intelligent circles without becoming angry at the people who are involved. So I'll do my best to finish it up next week. There is good news. As long as the grave is empty, the cross is empty, and Jesus Christ is at the right hand of God, good news. I understand, besides personally messing up children, why President Xi doesn't want it in China. For the same reason he doesn't want Christianity in China. He despises Jesus Christ, the Son of God. People play games about it being politics. No, it's about evil. It's about good and bad. The man is evil. A man like President Putin is evil. We got plenty of government officials I can just start naming evil. So I ask you to do this. Pray about it. Because I'll talk next week. I have some good news. I have some things that I can give positive. But if your life is not right with Jesus Christ this morning, if you are not his child in every sense of the way that life is removed from you, you now stand in a grace-related relationship with Jesus. We'll help you do that if you know what you need to do. If you need to be baptized into Christ, there is no better moment than now. If you need prayers, that's what we're here for as a group. Another reason, well, you come while we stand and sing.